Welcome again, folks, to the Washington Babylon podcast with Ken Silverstein. This week, we are bringing you an extended show about immigration in America and the deportation, incarceration, industrial complex. First, we bring you coverage of recent events in Central Falls, Rhode Island that have made national headlines.
Breaking overnight, an immigration protest in Rhode Island turns violent. A group of protesters blocking the Wyatt detention facility late last night say an officer drove a pickup truck right into the crowd. The demonstrators say they were also pepper sprayed. The center in Central Falls houses around 140 federal immigration detainees. The protesters are calling for the center to end its agreement with ICE.
The campaign to shut down the Wyatt has been going on since last winter, formulated by a coalition of immigration solidarity activists. Here is Katerina Lorenzo, director of the Alliance to Mobilize Our Resistance, or AMOR network, speaking in Central Falls at a rally that preceded the demonstration at the Wyatt.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's great to be here this beautiful day. This day, every day, we need to fight. And here I am behind the AMOR, the Alliance to Mobilize Our Resistance. My name is Katerina Lorenzo. I am the AMOR director. The Alliance to Mobilize Our Resistance, AMOR, is proud to join Never Again in denouncing the detention and deportation of our community members in Rhode Island and at the so-called U.S.-Mexico border. AMOR is here today in solidarity with the Jewish community that has shown up to resist the human rights abuses being committed in the concentration camps at the U.S.-Mexico border. AMOR believes that migration is a human right that must be upheld and defended. Today we return to the Wyatt Detention Center, where more than 100 people seeking asylum are being detained right now. Immigration authorities are setting very high bonds for the people that is being detained, range between $25,000 to $45,000. Neither the people detained nor their families can afford this. These bonds are just another tool used by an unjust system to continue separating families and extracting resources from community members that are targeted by discriminatory policies and practices every day. Shame. AMOR demands the people detained at Wyatt are allowed to leave the detention with lower bonds. Their asylum cases are being proceeded. Right. We must all work together to resist the criminalization of migration and to end all form of incarceration of our community. Whether in cells, whether in tents or camps, must to end. We continue to work to support people detained at Wyatt, other community members detained at the Bristol and Plymouth jail too, and people being targeted in Rhode Island always, every year again. Stop deportation, no more, no one more.
That was Katerina Lorenzo of the AMOR network speaking in Central Falls, Rhode Island. The audio is syndicated from a videotape provided by Steve Alquist of Uprise RI. Today, we are going to bring you an interview with Aurelie, who has been active with the campaign to shut down the Wyatt all year. The Shut Down ICE campaign we also discuss here requires a little background, so bear with me on the details. This campaign is taking on Massachusetts counties and their participation in 287G agreements. 287G agreements are contracts between ICE and local law enforcement agencies that allow local authorities to act as immigration officials within their jurisdictions. This includes questioning people about their immigration status and detaining people on immigration charges. 287G agreements expand the reach of ICE by involving more agents in carrying out their work and harnessing the resources of local agencies. They also lead to numerous problems within their communities as rates of racial profiling and civil rights violations against people of color increase. This makes it harder for undocumented community members to be in public space and participate in activities where they may have to give their personal information or law enforcement may be present. For more information on the Shutdown ICE campaign and how to bring it to your community, visit shutdownIceNow.org. That's SHUTDOWNICENOW.org. And now our interview with the amazing freedom fighter and activist and organizer in the Greater Providence area, Aurelie.
So I am an organizer with AMOR, right, the Alliance to Mobilize Our Resistance, and I'm also an organizer with the FAN Collective. And my role within AMOR has been particularly as a coordinator of the immigration team of AMOR, has been to case manage and provide support for people who have been affected by, who need support with their immigration cases, but also who have been affected by detainment and deportation. So that has allowed me to build connections with people that are detained inside of facilities in Massachusetts, and also support, make relationships with the people that have been, their family members that have been affected by the detainment and deportation of people. And through that work, that's where we really found out and made the connections that people that are detained from Rhode Island are held in Massachusetts and New Hampshire, but primarily in Massachusetts and not in Rhode Island, because Rhode Island does not, although it has one detention center, which is the Wyatt Detention Center in Central Falls, that detention center cannot legally hold Rhode Island residents. So people are being sent off primarily to Bristol County and Plymouth County while they await, while their immigration process continues or they await deportation. And in terms of the camp, and in the FAN Collective, I've been part of the Shutdown ICE campaign and have been a part of it since it started. And I think we decided to start that because we looked at how different members of the FAN Collective, right, were being affected by these policies. I myself personally am come from a mixed status family, have undocumented family members in Rhode Island, and so I'm trying to figure out. And also there's other members in the FAN Collective who have friends, family as well that are dealing with different immigration processes. So in figuring out how to support our collective members, and how to also start a campaign that supported AMOR's work, with stopping deportations of people from Rhode Island, we started that campaign to kind of involve all of that I just mentioned. And I guess I can describe both of the campaigns and kind of what their focus has been. So Shutdown Wyatt has been centered on the Wyatt Detention Center and has been primarily calling for the title, right? The broader goal is to shut down this institution, this facility in general, not just for the people that are detained there through ICE, but for the people that are incarcerated there. And but I think also calling for obviously ending the contract with ICE, but calling for much more than just shutting it down, because we know that if we shut it down, the way that the system works is that people are just going to get transferred somewhere else, because we shut down one doesn't mean that the rest will also get shut down, right? So thinking about, and it's something that we're still working on, but thinking about how we can also start making moves to look at what transformative justice could look like, right? And looking at how we can get people released and back into their families, either through bond or other means. to ensure that people are not just getting transferred to another facility and detained somewhere else or incarcerated somewhere else. So that's been shut down Wyatt, and focusing on different targets to kind of reach that ultimate goal of shutting down this facility. And shut down ICE has been focusing primarily on the 287G agreements that exist in Massachusetts counties. And we started that campaign because we felt like there was no real local resistance to these agreements, and we had seen that there was opposition, right, to sheriffs, because sheriffs can be tend to be conservative, and obviously very much believe in punishment, law and order, etc. But when we're talking about these agreements, right, it's pinpointing all of the facility, and kind of calling the entire county to change the way that they're allowing these sheriffs, who funny enough seem to have a lot of power in making these decisions for people, to collaborate with ICE in their own communities. And I think a lot of people have recently been there's been a lot of attention on what's happening in the so-called U.S.-Mexico border, for obviously there's incredibly fucked up things happening there right now, but I think there's also a need to focus on what's happening where people are based, and that's been at the core of the campaign, to trying to raise awareness around that these agreements exist, that people are being detained by ICE in these counties, and this whole idea that Massachusetts is a blue state and we're doing so great and we're liberal. It's there's actually pockets of counties that are extremely conservative, and this collaboration with ICE is existing here. And I would say that Massachusetts is one of the worst states in terms of imprisonment, incarceration, and treating people that are in prison in these places with basic decency. It's one of the worst places, and I think that kind of just goes unseen.
Right.
Yeah.
So what has your feeling been as an organizer, seeing the Wyatt campaign become a national headline news story over the last 7 days?
I mean, I think it's been good. I think it's been great. I think any attention that we can get to a local campaign like this is really great. And I think a lot of people also sleep on Rhode Island, sleep on the Northeast in general. It's kind of that general sense with Massachusetts that I was talking about, where they hear Northeast and they think, oh, that's generally a liberal area, right? We must be doing okay there. And because a lot of the attention has been focused on the Southwest, with good reason, I think it's kind of brought that attention, in particular, never again, their bigger actions have been in New Jersey, right, in New York, in Boston. But I think in Rhode Island, it's doing that action that has caused that national attention, due to the police violence that happened there, has been good. I think it's kind of woken up people to what happens. And I think the Wyatt is such a unique facility, where it's semi-public and semi-private, that I think it's not a model that you see a lot. So I think bringing the attention and hopefully the resources that come with that, right, to eventually shut it down and get people released is good. So yeah, I think it's definitely good. I think that bringing the attention is good. So yeah, I don't mind the attention at all.
I hear it. What are things about the Amore Network and the work that you guys are doing in there that you think people should better understand and comprehend?
About the Amore Network?
Yeah, because you're doing stuff 365 days a week, just that are besides just the actions at the Wyatt and ICE. You've got a whole range of support systems in place.
Yeah. Oh, and something else that I'll mention about the attention is that it's good that we get the attention because, like I said, Rhode Island community members can't be detained on the Wyatt. They're being sent out to Massachusetts. But so in thinking about folks that are seeking asylum from the border, they're being sent to the Wyatt. and they're primarily folks that are seeking asylum. So when we're talking about getting people released, paying bonds that are ridiculously high, it's good to have that attention. And I think with the Amor Network, yeah, I mean, we're constantly doing things. I think we're very ambitious, and I use ambitious in a very I think admirational way, and thinking that we can create this network of community-based resources, and yeah, I think we tried to set up a network that was as well-rounded as possible and trying to support people in different areas, because we didn't just want to be a network that responded to immigration issues, because even though I that's incredibly important, and I think that's many organizations are solely focused on just immigration. The coalition members that created the network felt like there was a need to provide much more than that, right? And I think at the core you have two main issues that we have been focusing on, which is immigration and police violence, and from there we have resources to support people with those different with those two main things, right? And that's the way I kind of see it, that people will call us for particular things around immigration, people will call us around particular things around police violence and police brutality, but there's many, when you start looking at individuals' case, you end up figuring out there's so many ways that you can support someone that kind of just goes unnoticed when you're only focusing on one, or you only provide specific support on one sole issue. And I think, yeah, we've been learning a lot as we go. I think we are definitely getting a huge influx of calls, and we definitely need help with managing all the calls and having more operators to answer the phone. But I think yeah, it's been really interesting and trying to figure out how to support people in these different areas, because while for our police violence support, we have the Community Defense Project, right, who is already I would say they have a high volume of people that they're working with, and those usually end up in lawsuits, right, against police departments that can drag on for a while. But in immigration, we're talking about trying to figure out how to do rapid response support in case someone's about to get detained, or trying to prevent that detainment. And then we're trying to also do support when someone's already been detained and is being held at a detention facility. So doing support for the person that's detained and for the family, right, that's being affected and is the one that's kind of carrying the weight for the person that's detained. And it's usually mothers who are kind of figuring this out on their own for their husbands or their partners, who end up becoming single moms, and then doing post deportation relief for families whose family member we couldn't support through legal aspect and got deported, and now the family's kind of having to deal with one less family member and not knowing when they're ever going to see them again. So yeah, it's all that different range of things that the immigration team is handling, and it's definitely a lot. And I think it's something that folks kind of knew it was going to be a lot of work, but we have really been relying for our different support teams that we have, right, to kind of do their own roles and plug it in the ways that they can, so that the immigration team can focus solely on supporting individuals. And also we're focusing on expanding the team and figuring out how to best get more volunteers to support us in that case management aspect, which has been a central part of the team's work. But yeah, I think that's something that I don't think a lot of people know. I think people think that, for the immigration team we just do referrals to lawyers. It's actually we try to do this kind of holistic case management that goes beyond what even licensed social workers that work at I don't know, a government agency would do. So and that's the kind of support that we want to provide for people, because we feel like that's what's lacking and from these like government agencies and like these institutions and even like bigger nonprofit agencies that try to really create this like separation between like what's community support and like what's a job, right? And for us, like we're trying to like create a network of that can really like feel like you're being supported by community. And that's why we think it's so important that like people who have some like been directly impacted be a part of these like decision making and like are also part of the work as well in supporting individuals. So it's like slowly working towards like getting people that we've supported to then become, you know, part of the teams and like continue that, because the whole goal is that like we have like an infrastructure where we're all taking care of each other and like we don't need to like wait for like politicians to like pass policies that will help us. It's like we have the support that we need and like it's coming from like community members, and it's coming from like just like wanting to like help each other out in the ways that we want and can. So that's like the longer term vision, you know, and right now we're just kind of like in crisis mode because of like all these policies and shit, but we're hoping that we can like we have like some time to kind of build that out when we're like less in crisis mode.
Gotcha. So how are you doing as an individual organizer and activist who's been doing this work?
How am I doing?
Yeah, I mean, this is a heavy duty amount of struggle you guys have been working with.
Well, I think, you know, as like Amor only has 2 staff members, and that's Cata and myself. And I think because like we are blessed to be like paid organizers, and we like acknowledge that. I acknowledge that that's something very like when organizing it's very difficult to get access to like funding to like get yourself paid and have this be like your job, your full-time job. So I'm very grateful for that and this opportunity to do it. But I think definitely like having to figure out how to manage, right, like the longer term vision of what this like having to manage coalition numbers, one, having to manage like creating this network and these teams, but then also being a part of and carrying a lot of the work of certain teams themselves has been something that I think has like, and then like dealing with finances, blah blah blah, all that back, you know, that like administrative stuff, has been something that's very overwhelming. And I think it's something that I would say like as a general we need a lot of support. I think what's the hardest for me is sometimes creating boundaries with people, right? Like because once you start like supporting an individual and you see all these ways that you can support them, it's like very hard to get out of this mode of like, oh, I feel like I can like try to do almost everything for you because I know like you're going through this horrible experience, and then you get to know people, right, on a very personal level because they start trusting you, but also realizing that like, oh, like I have a life and like I shouldn't have to be thinking about work 24/7, even though like we are on call 24/7 kind of, has been hard. So yeah, I think trying to figure out like the balance of like kind of case managing my own life, case managing my family's life who are also like being affected, right, and then coming to work and then like case managing for other people has been a little overwhelming. But I think overall, I think I've met like amazing people in the different teams, like people that we support and also people that like are volunteers with us. So I'm very happy about that, about like the connections that I've made in like almost all the areas of Amor. So yeah, I don't take that for granted.
Gotcha. If you would like to support the Amor Network, visit http://amorri.org. That's AMORRI.org. Next up, we are going to bring you some interview audio that Ken Silverstein recently recorded in preparation for the August 19th publication of a story with the New Republic titled Shock Corridor, the first inside report for an ICE mental health facility. So Ken, you've got a new story out in the New Republic this week, and we're going to be showcasing some of your interviews that you did with the preparation of that story. Tell us all about them.
Well, I went down to Miami, where there is one of the more notorious facilities in the country holding immigrants. It's called the Krome Detention Center. It started off as a Cold War facility, as a military base. It transitioned, it being Florida once, when large numbers of Haitians and Cubans started coming into the United States. It was transitioned to an immigration detention facility. It's got a history of abuses going back from the very, very beginning. I mean, people joke in a dark way in Miami about, whatever happens, don't run a traffic light. If you end up at Krome, you'll disappear. It's a place just with a very, very bad history. And the federal government, before the Trump administration, but also continuing with the Trump administration, has been highlighting that ICE has turned Krome into an ideal facility for detainees with mental health problems, which, needless to say, whenever a government is putting out a propaganda line or a political narrative, it almost invariably ends up to be false. I mean, initially I heard about Krome being touted as this mental health marvel for immigration detainees, and I instantly thought, this has got to be crap, because I lived in Miami for a year and a half. I've been going down there on recording trips for 20 years, and Krome's always been talked about as this hellhole where nobody wants to end up. And needless to say, you peel back the covers a little bit, and you see that it is indeed hardly a model mental health facility. They set up a little Potemkin Village unit where they house 30 detainees. And even there, basically what it appears to be, and I got in, I'm the first reporter who, if I can brag for a minute, I'm the first reporter who got into this facility without minders from ICE or Krome personnel overseeing interviews with detainees. And of course, everyone knows you can't interview detainees, prisoners, when they're, when jail or detention camp employees are around, because it inhibits them from speaking honestly. I was taken in as a community member by members of a great advocacy group down there called the Friends of Miami-Dade Detainees. And so I got in, and I was able to interview detainees, as were three members of this group that came in with me. And they had already compiled a lot of information, they being this advocacy group I referred to. And they helped me quite a bit with this story. But what you hear from detainees is that, A, there's this tremendous reliance on overly medicating detainees, sometimes into a more or less zombie-like state, where, one guy told me that he went to the psych ward, which Krome keeps completely under wraps. He went there in the middle of the night to get medication. This is where they keep the real problem cases. They have a little Potemkin Village unit, as I mentioned, where they keep a small number of detainees with mental health issues, and then that periodically they let journalists into, as they oversee the exchanges between the detainees and the journalists. But then there's a psych ward, which nobody knew about, where they literally throw the worst cases, people with the most serious mental health problems. And this guy said, it was the middle of the night. They keep the lights blaring 24/7, bright lights, but everybody was zonked out on medication. Then they also ship detainees out if they're causing problems to Larkin Hospital, a local hospital in the Miami area, which has its own very, very troubling past, and where I heard that detainees were mistreated. And then there's also, they use, and it's not clear how many prisoners have been put into solitary. They call it segregated housing, but it's solitary confinement, which it's torture, effectively torture for anyone, but it's particularly torture for someone suffering from mental illness. So they also make use of solitary confinement for detainees. I compared it to the One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, the famous movie and book by Ken Kesey, where it's just I don't even know still how to describe it, but let's just use the word hellhole. I mean, it's touted as providing the best mental care in the country for immigrant detainees, and because it's isolated, it's hard to get to. The media is not allowed in without minders. They've even kept Elizabeth Warren at one point tried to go to this facility, to Homestead actually, which is that's where kids are separated. Kids who have been separated from their families are held. And by the way, those kids, if they turn 18 when they're at Homestead or another facility in Florida, their 18th birthday present is a trip to Krome once they become legally adults. So you've got this, the situation in Krome in general is really, really nasty. And that we've come to expect, unfortunately. We know that immigrants are being abused in these horrifying conditions. So in this case, though, I looked at one particular angle, the mental health angle, and found that it's, more or less what you'd expect, but got details that previously hadn't been reported.
Silky Shah, it is a pleasure to have you on the Washington Babylon podcast. You have been a source, and I think of you as a friend, even though we don't know each other well. A source on immigration stories, and you know the topic as well as anybody. But before getting to questions, can you tell the audience a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Well, thanks so much for having me on, Kim. It's wonderful to talk to you about this. I am the executive director of Detention Watch Network, and we're a national coalition trying to end the use of immigration detention in the U.S. And so I've been working on the issue of immigration detention for over 15 years now. Obviously, it's changed a lot. It's in the news a lot more. People sort of know a little bit more what I do these days. But yeah, have really a background in organizing around these issues in Texas, and then I've been working at the national level for a pretty long time, trying to combat the growth of immigration detention.
Yeah, I generally refer to it as the immigration industrial complex, which is what it's grown into, quite disturbingly. You alluded to something in introducing yourself that I wanted to ask you about first. You said that people now know what you're doing, and I was wondering, what do you think took so long before people started focusing on this issue? It's been around for a long time. That criminalization of immigrants and would-be immigrants is something that's not entirely new. What took the public so long to wake up to this? Because all of a sudden, I mean, it's been on the topic predates, and this is question 2, so don't even go here yet. But I want to ask you about the history. Trump is. We've talked about this before. This was a problem before Trump, but is it Trump that woke the public up? Is it because it's gotten so much more attention under Trump? What finally put this at the front burner for a lot of people?
Sure. I think it's a combination of factors, but I do think Trump is at the height of it, and we'll talk a little bit more about how we got to this point. But both, there is just this sort of different moment where people are paying attention to what the administration is doing and scrutinizing it more in different ways. And I think that's been part of it. I also think the Trump administration is, sort of, they're like caricatures of evil, right? Like everything they're doing is just this like level that, you in some ways, some of it you couldn't even fathom before. And so I think particularly on immigration, even though all of these pieces were terrible and the machinery was huge before, you handed it to this administration, then just took it to the next level. And so what we've seen is actually just so much more detention growth in the last 2.5 years. And so I think it's a combination of, yes, it was happening before, but Trump is somebody who's getting scrutinized, and his administration is getting scrutinized in a way that might have not happened before, and people are wanting to do something about it, feeling the desire to be more active. And two, it's significantly worse. I mean, we were at 38,000 immigration detention beds at the end of the Obama administration. We're now at 55,000 currently of the number of people who are detained at any given day.
Right. Okay. So let me step back to the Obama years for a second, and even before then. I mean, things are significantly worse under Trump, and I want to get to that. And you said it's like caricatures of evil, and I want to get specifically to how things got worse under Trump. But first, lay out for me, when does this policy, where the criminalization of immigrants begin? I mean, it predates Obama, but because I've cited you in previous stories, the history of this far better than I. Can you sort of lay out the origins of this? And then I want to ask you specifically about what things were like under Obama. Did he make progressive policy, or were his policies also quite flawed? And then let's get to Trump. But first, origins of this, this horrible policy towards immigrants, where there's this, predetermination that they're doing something wrong. I mean, we're a country of immigrants, and suddenly there's this immense hostility. Where does that originate? I mean, is that the Bush administration? Is it the Clinton administration? When does this date to?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question, and it's great that you'll be talking more about Krome, because Krome is a facility in Florida that was actually one of the first sort of detention centers in the context that we know detention now to be used in the 80s, and specifically for Cuban and Haitian refugees. So, in the context of what we know detention as now, and the growth of it, I think you can't disconnect it from the growth of mass incarceration in the U.S. Obviously, in the 70s to now, we got from 300,000 people in prisons in the U.S. to over 2.1 million people. It's a massive amount of growth. A lot of criminalization is just happening generally. When in the 80s, you saw, during the Cold War, this sort of growth of detention to detain Cubans and Haitians. And then it started to slowly pick up, still relatively small numbers of people in like a couple thousand beds in the 80s, and getting up to maybe 6,000 or 7,000 in the early 90s. But a couple laws were being passed. One is one law called mandatory detention, which initially became law in the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1988. There was a few of those acts in the 80s, and that's the one where mandatory detention came in this policy called aggravated felony, which, in terms of what those words mean, it sort of means nothing in the immigration context. It doesn't have to be aggravated. It doesn't have to be a felony. And it's something that means that somebody has to be detained or has to be deported without any sort of assessment. A judge can't, have any sort of discretion around it.
You mean
if they have this, if they commit a crime, yeah.
If they're committed of an aggravated felony, then they are automatically deported.
Automatically detained, and then will do their best to sort of fight it, but essentially automatically deported as well. That's sort of the framing of mandatory detention, mandatory deportation for a certain set of crimes.
Mm-hmm.
And so that sort of starts to happen in the late 80s. And this is Reagan, Bush administration. And then you get into the Clinton administration, and that's really where we see the big paradigm shift in the sort of, the foundations of what we see as mass criminalization now. In 1996, two laws were passed, the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act, which passed after the Oklahoma City bombing.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously we know the person who committed that crime was not an immigrant, and a white man trained by the U.S. military. And then you have the Illegal Immigration and Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act, IRA, and both of those passed in 1996, and they did a few things. One is they expanded the scope of people who could be mandatorily detained, mandatorily deported, expanded the scope of aggravated felony. So now you even had something like a misdemeanor shoplifting conviction equal an aggravated felony in the immigration context. And then it also did two more things. One is that it used to be sort of this paradigm of, resident versus non-resident. So people who had green cards were able to have some discretion and weren't subject to mandatory detention, et cetera. And now it just expanded it and it made this sort of paradigm of citizen versus non-citizen. So anybody, of the people who are sort of in the category of not naturalized citizen could be targeted for detention and deportation. And then lastly, it was retroactive. So you had cases like my friend Jean Montreville, who is a Haitian immigrant who came here in the 80s, had a drug conviction, served time for his crime, got out, started a family, had several U.S. citizen children, and then ended up being caught up in the system after 9/11. And despite his crime and his sentence and serving that sentence happened in the 80s, he was still targeted. And then ultimately last year he was deported after fighting his case for several years. And so
let me make sure I understand this because it's pretty extraordinary. You're saying that this was during the Clinton years that people who had previously committed crimes or no matter and the expansion of what was made you eligible if that's the right word for detention and deportation was greatly expanded. But you're saying that even if the crime had been committed in the past, you could go you could be put in the deportation pipeline. I mean, they passed a law, this was 96, and if you had committed a crime going how far back? Indefinitely, you could then be detained and deported for a past.
Yeah, basically. So it didn't matter when the crime was committed. It's just that now you had this something on your record that said that violated your immigration status.
So it literally could have been, there was no limit. It could have been 20 years prior.
Yeah.
My God, that's,
Yeah.
Given the number of young people who do dumb things, and I would put myself in that category. I mean, my God, my record going back some years is not entirely spotless. I mean, when you're 20 years old, you do some dumb things. So
I remember this story about this young woman who is from St. Lucia, I believe, and she's a legal permanent resident. I think she was like caught with weed and, had like a $50 fine that she paid. And then she ended up later, a few years later, ended up going to see her family in St. Lucia with her mom and then came back into the country and was detained then for a long period of time. So that kind of story is something we've heard a lot of people not realizing that they could be subject to detention and deportation.
Right.
Because they, ostensibly they quote unquote paid their debt to society. They did the thing they were supposed to do. But it's also indicative of like the bigger problems with the criminal justice system or injustice system, whatever we want to call it, in the U.S. And how pervasive it is inside society, and then how it sort of connects to all these other systems. And so I think this idea, I think a lot of times people are like, oh, the relationship between immigration and criminal justice system, and it's expanding, it's new and whatever. And it's like, no, it's just been there. It's been there since the beginning in so many ways. And at least of this system. And any fight that we have against immigration detention has to be in the context of that broader fight against mass incarceration in the U.S.
Right. So quickly, a fast question. The Clinton, these two bills passed during the Clinton years, did they pass with overwhelmingly bipartisan support, and they were Clinton administration initiatives?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's what I figured. But I wanted to.
It was, those years, a lot was able to pass. A lot of really harsh stuff was able to pass under the Clinton administration in the 90s. So this was a significant impact of that. And I think a lot of people think about it, especially just 9/11. 9/11 was obviously such a turning point in the context of the shift to having the Department of Homeland Security and having Immigration and Customs Enforcement as opposed to INS under the Department of Justice. And that all was absolutely significant, and I think has led us down this path. But the foundation of these laws and the way that we are able to do what we're able to do in terms of targeting immigrants was set in the 90s and the 1996 laws in so many ways. And so in the early 2000s, whenever we saw that shift happening after 9/11, a lot of what shifted, a lot of people were like, oh, the Patriot Act, and obviously all this stuff has been really damaging, but really 96 laws were critical. And then the other thing that was really critical to getting us to the system that we have today is the amount of money that started to be funneled into DHS after 9/11.
And a lot of that money was used to enforce immigration law?
Yeah. So this shift to saying, okay, you had this entity called Immigration Naturalization Service that ended up being broken out into, like immigration customs enforcement. The sole purpose is to enforce immigration law, no longer this question of naturalization there. And then you had Citizen and Immigration Services where the naturalization arm was. And then now Customs and Border Protection where you also had this like very intentional border militarization piece happening.
Right. Okay.
Which was happening before also. So, but at the same time now that there's just this even heightened sense that these agencies' purposes are just so clearly defined. I mean, after 9/11, the ICE's strategic plan called Operation Endgame was literally, we shall remove all removable people for the purpose of public safety and national security.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, quickly, what about Obama? I mean, people, I think, tend to think, and I don't know, frankly, that Obama was, I mean, we have Trump now, and so the sort of
Obama looks great in the context of Trump. That's I mean, at least how people perceive it, right? I think there's a lot of less knowledge about the scope of what Obama did.
So tell me a little bit, because what it sounds like you're saying is, we start seeing this in the 80s, and it slowly builds. It expands dramatically under Clinton. 9/11 is another turning point. Does Obama do anything to stem this tide, or does he contribute to its furtherance?
I mean, in so many ways, the Obama administration was about institutionalizing the systems that were in place. And so the Bush administration, what was interesting is that you had over 350 detention facilities. It was DHS was absolute chaos. They didn't know what they were doing. You didn't know where people were detained. People were transferred regularly. And yeah, it was just a mess of a system. Mm-hmm. And so Obama came in, and a lot of the intention of the administration was to, quote unquote, reform the detention system, but reform it to make the conditions better, reform it for more transparency, not necessarily more accountability, but more transparency. And so now they implemented something called the online detainee locator system, which allowed loved ones or lawyers to find people in detention, whereas before people had no idea where people were being taken. They consolidated the number of facilities, so you had now 200 facilities as opposed to 350. So a lot bigger facilities that the intention was to have higher levels of standards in these larger facilities, but very committed to using private facilities and still outsourcing practically all detention to either private companies or county jails. And then yeah, I think there was this idea that Obama was gonna make it a more humane system. So it was like, it's fine that we're detaining people, but let's make it more humane. And then on top of that, I mean, make it more efficient. So a lot of what happened in the Bush era was, we're going to target people through mass, worksite raids, like what we just saw in Mississippi. Really mass worksite raids, and these, where ICE is sort of like playing these cowboys and going in. And Obama really expanded the relationship between ICE and local police by expanding certain programs like 287G, which makes local police immigration enforcers. This was happening in the Bush administration, expanded under Obama. Putting forward this program called Secure Communities that actually had DHS databases accessible within county jails. Expanding the criminal alien program, which has ICE actually, housed at local county jails. And so all these ways because the way that Obama talked about it was, I'm going to target the criminals, and really emphasize that. And actually, so in so many ways, even though there was this intent to make the system better or more efficient or more humane, it doubled down on the good immigrant versus bad immigrant idea. And I think that's been particularly damaging for our work. It actually, in so many ways, is something that Trump has been able to, emphasize for his cause. And so I think that's the Obama administration really, really focused on the good immigrant versus bad immigrant and the criminalization piece in these contexts. And so there was this intention, especially in the first term, to like make detention better, but meant actually like expanding detention to like nicer facilities. And from our perspective, it was like, you're just expanding detention essentially. And detaining people who don't need to be detained. And then in 2014, it just all kind of went out the window. Obama brought back family detention in full force with the opening of a couple new facilities in New Mexico for a period of time, and then in Texas more permanently, in Dilley, Texas, which is over 2,000 bed family detention center. So really starting to their idea was like, we're going to keep these families together, but we're going to keep them together in detention. And so his response was to actually expand detention at that period. And so that's why by the end of his administration, we actually saw an increase. I think early part of administration was about 30,000 beds, and we got to 38,000. So we saw an increase in detention, an increase in number of people who were detained over the course of the year, a high level of people being deported, both in like close to 500,000 for both over the course of the year. And there was some concessions like deferred action for childhood arrivals, which is something that Dreamers were really pushing and had to do something. But ultimately, in so many ways, the system, solidified and institutionalized and just really expanded the scope of like who was being targeted and what ICE could do and what local police and local authorities could do to target people.
Right. Okay, so how then, I mean, it's not a pretty picture under Obama. It's worse under Trump, you said. I mean, the number of beds has increased from 38,000 to how many?
Currently, it's 55,000. Despite ICE not being funded for that, they're increasing the number of people who are being detained without actually having the resources from Congress.
Right. Okay, so, but how? I mean, that's a dramatic increase. I mean,
It's huge.
I'm not a mathematician, but that's about a 50% increase in the last 3 years, or less than 3 years, I guess. So, what is it that makes the Trump administration's policies worse? Beyond, I mean, the rhetoric is clearly worse, but practically speaking, you said it's like almost caricatured evil. What are the worst aspects of Trump's policies, and particularly in ways that, where he's advanced, and I'm using that term sarcastically, from the Obama administration? How have they not beyond the rhetoric, which is ugly and nasty, but what have they done to make it easier to deport people, detain people, and to make the lives of people who are detained utterly miserable? And many of them who have committed no serious offenses. The great majority, as far as I can tell, are people who have gotten caught up on lesser charges. I mean, we're not talking for the most part about murderers and, hey, we've all got our problems. I haven't done a scientific survey of who's being detained, but I've been to two of these immigration camps now, and most of the people seem to be detained on what would be petty charges if they did not have questions about their immigration status. Anyway, that was a very inelegant and long way of putting it. But what's Trump done specifically that distinguishes himself in a really significant way from Obama and prior policy in general?
Sure. Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think there's a lot of different ways this has happened. I mean, one is it's just more. So it's like, let's have more detention beds. Let's deport as fast as we possibly can. So expanding a policy called expedited removal, which is even like a more extreme form of mandatory detention, mandatory deportation. Insane for people who would just come into the country recently, or it's usually for people who come to the country recently and now expanding it to people who come in the country in the last 2 years. The other thing I would say is, when you look at the detention system now and you look at it under Obama, it was, a lot of people being targeted in the interior, ending up in the system. I think now you have this really big, except towards the end of his administration, and also just like we've seen just an increase in folks seeking asylum over the last 6 years or so. There's the way that the Department of Justice in particular and Attorney General have been, both under Sessions and now under Barr, have been trying to just do everything they can to take away asylum protections has been huge. So under the Obama administration, you saw actually like there was a policy for parole for people who pass credible fear or reasonable fear interviews, and now that's kind of gone away. So this is why you see people just staying in detention for a longer period of time. Also moving court proceedings to Mexico, the migrant protection protocols, where you actually have migrants staying in Mexico, but then their lawyers in the US trying to figure out how to support them, which is just a really difficult process. In general, immigration law is such a complicated set of laws, and there's more lawyers working on this. There's not enough. Most people don't have representation while they're going through proceedings, and they're just making it harder and harder. On top of the fact that they're saying there's like a set of folks who just can't actually seek asylum anymore. Reducing the number of
what set of folks is that?
Like, for instance, there's different like matters of that have been put out by the Department of Justice. But for instance, people who have been subject to domestic violence in, Guatemala, Honduras, and Central America no longer have the same type of protections that they could have had before because of things being passed by this administration, and being put forth in terms of policies by this administration. So things like that, where you just see stripping away potential protections that people would have. I think there's, in terms of the conditions inside, I think one of the things that I would say, just like from a bigger frame, is that under the Obama administration, there was like a lot of attention on headquarters, and Jay Johnson was secretary of DHS for a period of time. And just, the way that, policies and everything was being structured at the federal level and then being pushed out to the field offices. I think what Trump has really done has made the field offices more like have the agency to do whatever they want, like to sort of go target people. And also you see it with the way guards treat people inside detention. There is something about that like visceral impact of the way he's naming things, even, you know, the executive orders that came out in the first days of his administration, all of it was to kind of like push this idea that actually like all these entities have sort of a lot more reign to do whatever they want to do. And so I think that's been really impactful as well. But I do think ultimately like more detention, faster deportations, worsening conditions. There's been a higher number of deaths that we've seen throughout different forms of detention that exist, including Customs and Border Protection detention.
Mm-hmm.
And also, you know, you see the detention system sort of expanding, proliferating into other agencies a bit more. And so even Office of Refugee Resettlement facilities are becoming more detention. Like, even though they have been detention, like to some degree, it's like even expanding. So I think that's a lot of it, is just like, let's do more of this. And then for us, in terms of our targeting of site fights, we're trying to stop new facilities from coming in or shut down existing facilities. The administration and the companies have gotten really good about circumventing any like public practices around this. And so they're just sort of doing, again, whatever they want without, any oversight.
Right. Okay. And it sounds like what you're saying, and logically speaking, this makes sense, that the administration's rhetoric and aggressiveness has emboldened everyone from guards to bureaucrats to be more callous and cruel and brutal towards.
Absolutely.
Okay. That has been my distinct impression as well.
And then there's been specifics, right? I mean, I think last year everybody really was alarmed by the family separation crisis. And I mean, in truth, like, family separation is something that's been happening with the system generally. But I think in that context, that's where you see this bigger, even more extreme intersection of criminalization and immigration, where, people are being criminalized for the act of crossing the border or the act of crossing the border twice without documents. And that system's also expanding, and that system was expanding under Obama as well. But family separation last summer was like this very intentional connection to, hey, we're going to prosecute you if you do this. And so, and so much of this administration, same with Obama, has been like this deterrence strategy. It's like, if we do this, they're not going to come, which is just not true at all. And also just a very inhumane way to treat people in the context of other people potentially not coming. But yeah, I think again, the family separation crisis and the way they handled that was, it was very chaotic. It was, people didn't know where their kids were. I mean, people are more fearful of coming forward to be sponsors for kids who are coming too, and that also exacerbates the problems within the system, because if they're coming forward, then if there are questions about their status, they're worried that the Trump administration is going to target them. And so it's just this sort of, cycle of problems that are created by this administration being around, and both in terms of actual policy changing, but also the sort of environment that creates the conditions that we're in now, where detention has expanded so much.
Right. And I've got one final question, and this is unfair because it's, it's a explosive question, but and because tragically we're running out of time, I need to ask you to respond to it sort of briefly. But AOC recently referred to these camps as concentration camps, and that opened up a huge debate, and there was something of a backlash against her. I'll go forward and say that, in my view, that's an accurate description. She didn't say death camps. We are seeing deaths at these camps, which is, abysmal, but I think it's inaccurate to say these are death camps. But in my thinking, when you herd a despised minority into subhumane conditions and treat them brutally and offer them no legal protections, you're looking at something that very closely resembles concentration camps. It's a loaded term because people immediately say, oh, you're comparing it to the Nazi camps. But, I mean, you had Japanese Americans rounded up before World War II and herded into camps. I mean, you don't have to immediately make a Nazi analogy. That's what, that's where most people go. And that's where this is dismissed. But to me, the term, as I understand it, putting aside like, is this Nazi Germany, where we are not, in my view, at this point. But I mean, is concentration camps getting carried away? I mean, how do you see these detention facilities?
That's a good question. And yes, a loaded question. I mean, I will say that, for a while we avoided using the term in the context that I think because of the way history is taught, what people know as harm that's done is the Holocaust, and will equate anything to the Holocaust because that's what they know the best. So it complicates things a little bit, but I think in the context of like an actual terminology of what is happening, I don't think concentration camps is a problematic term to use in that context. I think it's just, we don't want to confuse people.
Right.
And like you said, it's not the death camps, and that's, I mean, even people have died in detention, but it's not what that was. And so I think we need to be really clear about that distinction. But ultimately, it's interesting how much there's been a lot more education about Japanese internment happening right now. And I think that's something that it would be beneficial for our movement and our work to sort of understand that history better in the context of what's happening now. And I feel the more we can sort of position this politically to paint that bigger picture, hopefully the better we'll get to a place that is much more morally appropriate than what we're doing now, which is actually, quite inhumane and harsh, and people are suffering deeply. And so I think, I think it's I think it's great that people are raising these questions and talking about it, because it's also, somebody said to me recently that the US is pathologically ahistorical, and it's so true. And I think the more we can actually learn from the lessons of the past, my hope is that we'll move forward in a better direction. So I think it's great that the conversation's happening.
Okay, well, I'm going to have to move on, primarily because I have to call the next guest, and so I'm running up against the schedule. I'd love to talk to you more about this, but thanks for being on. And I am working on a story, and I'm going to be in touch with you soon, but I don't want to talk about that now because that story is a few months away from publication. But expect to hear from me shortly.
Sounds good. Thank you, Ken. It's always great chatting with you.
Dr. Peggy Mustelier, thank you for being on the podcast. I really appreciate it. We got to know each other a little bit when I was down in Florida recently reporting on the ICE Krome detention facility. And you had a lot of interesting insights, and I'm glad you are able to be on today. The first thing I want to do is ask you simply to tell listeners a little bit about yourself, your background, and your experience as a psychologist and also as an advocate.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Silverstein. Ken, I've been a psychologist for the last 15 years and have been involved really on and off since even prior to my training with different groups and issues, different groups that are marginalized and issues relating to human rights. And then most recently, in the last 5 years or 6 years, we got together and formed a group which later became a nonprofit as a immigration detention visitation group as advocates.
Mm-hmm. And that's the Friends of Miami-Dade Detainees?
Yeah. Our purpose, our primary mission is to end isolation and to be the eyes and ears both for the people who, again, a lot of these issues are often kind of in the shadows, not really very public. Until recently, you're hearing more. But for many years, you didn't really hear about a lot of the things that happened, including really some very blatant human rights violations and illegal occurrences.
Mm-hmm. Well, I have a few other questions, but I definitely want to quickly turn to that, the severity of the violations, and particularly at Krome, where I both went with a couple of other advocates from your organization. First, I wanted to ask you, though, if you can talk about this. Florida is at the epicenter of this immigration problem and the detention problem, the detention network. I mean, a lot of there's some states that stand out in terms of the number of detainees and frankly, the horror stories we're hearing from around the country. And Florida certainly is, as I said, at the epicenter. What makes Florida different and worse, I guess, than some other places? I mean, it's a nationwide issue now. It has been for a long time. But why is Florida, what makes Florida special in terms of being especially bad?
Yeah. Well, for starters, Florida, and specifically South Florida, is quite multicultural, very multifarious, many people from all over the world, including, it's closer to the entryway for both asylum seekers over the border, as well as people who have come in undocumented, or people who remained. So I think that's a big part of it. Also, perhaps with some of the exile movements as well. So both Cuba and some of the policies related to that, as well as Haiti, which is diametrically opposite to, up until recently, the policies with Cuba.
Mm-hmm. But what, in a sense, Miami has been the mayor of Miami in particular has been very retrograde in his approach to immigration. I mean, it's ironic in some ways because, it's a multicultural city. It's a city of immigrants.
Yes.
So it's sort of unexpected that, in some ways, that Florida would be, and Miami in particular, would be so right wing and on immigration. Is there anything? I mean, it's a fairly conservative state outside of some big cities, but is it? I mean, the state legislature has passed some incredibly regressive laws, and I'm just wondering. I mean, is it simply state politics? Why is there not more? I mean, this is not a yes or it's maybe too complicated. And it may, because we're not doing this live, I can say this, we may end up cutting this.
Sure.
But, why is it that Florida, which is a very culturally diverse state, and Miami in particular, is it simply that? I mean, it seems, the mayor of Miami is Cuban. But there's this hostility towards immigrants. Is there is issue a political weapon that's being used to gin up votes for, I presume, primarily Republicans in the legislature? But how did things, has Florida always been this bad on immigration? And
it's really interesting that you would ask. And in the interest of brevity, I'm going to just connect some dots, which are always surprising to me. Number one, yes, no doubt the politics in Florida have been, in South Florida, there is a very strong conservative Republican base. And many of them seem to be formed, not exclusively, but I would say the majority, by the first wave of Cuban exiles. So people, my parents and grandparents, for example, which, by the way, my family is Cuban as well.
Mhm.
And I say this because you see, as you go down, most people in my age group and younger are actually leaning more toward being more liberal and more tolerant, more accepting of others. But within this initial influx and the experiences, it seems that For example, I remember when we went to the commission, right, and we spoke before Jimenez as well as the rest of the commissioners. I am not kidding, Ken, when I tell you there were easily over 200 people from all walks of life, including police officers. I remember a Marine saying Semper Fi, he kept repeating it. Teachers, people, caregivers for children whose parents had been deported. All of these people talking about the importance of not legislating in favor of this race. And at the time, we were discussing the issue of sanctuary cities.
Sorry, not legislating in favor of what?
Oh, in favor of racism, of this brand of, in favor of this kind of really, honestly, just a hateful practice, right? Hate as defined by that exclusionary and kind of marginalized approach, right? Where there's the in-group and the important groups, and the rest are sort of left on the sidelines. And even psychologically, you think of terms such as the alien. One of the first steps to dehumanization of any form is to be able to objectify another. You see this across the board psychologically with any form of crime or debasement or any way of minimizing or dehumanizing another individual. So even terms such as alien are very, very relevant,
Right.
very significant. Not a human being, an alien, not even an undocumented person. So what was curious to me was how many of us spoke out with Jimenez and shared our feelings. And then it was just
the mayor of Miami.
Correct. Yeah. Sorry, Mayor Jimenez. And there were only a handful, and I'm not kidding, maybe 10, less than 10 people who spoke out in favor or against, opposed to the sanctuary cities. And it was almost like a caricature. And I hate to say this, but really it was just like what you would imagine as the old time racist, right? Speaking. It was really, really shocking to me how accepted that became, how mainstream that, and how blatantly it disregarded the view and the feelings of the people, just by numbers, right? I mean, a mayor, any.
But what, and that's exactly what I'm curious about, is if there are so many people in a city like Miami, which, is not a rural outpost where you'd be sort of expect a more anti-immigrant politics.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
I mean, given the number, the numbers you're discussing, it's still sort of a mystery. I mean, aren't politicians in Miami in particular, if not Florida broadly, who could rally a more progressive constituency to oppose the current detention and deportation policies and my operation with it? Why? I mean, is it just, as we see so frequently, where you have a political establishment that is not entirely answerable to their constituency, but playing to a more narrow base?
Well, I'll tell you, it's curious to observe. And again, while this is a little bit out of my expertise, I certainly know enough information. No, it's fine. I just thought I should, for the benefit, for the integrity of this conversation, let you know that while it is not my expertise, I certainly probably know more than the average person in terms of observing and following the politics from our current senator, Scott, to the different policies in the state and the mass corruption really based on money. And this is documented. This isn't speculation. This isn't, so-called fake news. This is stuff that is very well. And so you're observing, when we go to the issue of immigration detention, right? So we have Krome, which is a federal prison. We have BTC, which is a privately owned. All of these things involve money.
Center.
Yes. I'm sorry. Yeah. Broward Transitional Center. Money is at the center of this, especially for the private prison owners.
Yes.
Right? This is a very large market. And in fact, as you know, it's not limited to immigration, it's prisons in general.
Yeah.
But something that is noteworthy, a few things that really strike me when you look at the inconsistencies, a few things among many. Number one, the idea of what is, it's the idea of immigration. For starters, it's actually a civil violation, not a criminal, and yet people are treated as criminals. And secondly, and I hope I'm not going, I hope this isn't terribly tangential, but I believe it's very much related to the core, the crux of these arguments. When I speak to people in Miami about the idea, for instance, of now the so-called caravan or the influx of people from Latin America coming in from Central and South America, Central America specifically right now, which, by the way, as an aside, I actually did go to Tijuana to go see for myself, which is usually my advice to anyone. If you're concerned about the news, go learn on your own, go see and observe. And what's really interesting to me is that when I speak to people, and sadly, it wasn't just old-time Cubans, I was surprised to meet people from other countries that were that definitely had a distinct prejudice and were really biased against people coming in and held the belief, and this isn't the first time we've heard this, right? Held the belief that these people are putting their lives in danger or their children's lives in danger unnecessarily. And so two things come to mind, right? Number one, the Cuban exiles, when they came, in their majority, perhaps with the exception of the people who were in the Batista government, but in the majority, these were political refugees, right? These were people, this was an issue of, this was an economic issue, as well as an ideological, right? As opposed to having necessarily their lives in danger. I don't doubt that this was the case in many cases, but it wasn't really the central reason for leaving. So when I kind of juxtapose that against what's going on and the lack of credibility, and then I think back on another issue, which was near and dear to my culture's heart, the case of Elian in the early 2000s under President Clinton, and at the time we had Janet Reno in Florida. And it was interesting to observe how passionately people felt about this mother having given her life and risked her child's life for freedom. It wasn't because his life was in danger. And personally, I understood that sentiment in many ways. I know that it wasn't a simple situation. I know that there were a lot of variables involved. But at a purely emotional level, I felt for my culture and the pain that they'd gone through and that experience. And so what I find really interesting is that now, under 20 years later, we have cases of hundreds of people coming in fighting for their lives, whom I met personally. And the reaction is one that is so, just really so detached, in many ways very uncaring, very cold, lacking in any empathy or humanity. Just a brief excerpt. When I was in Tijuana, I went to visit a bunch of women. They were staying at a safe house, and these were all the women with children. And I remember the last day that I went to visit, one of the attorneys who was also volunteering and came over and had just spoken to them about how there was a good chance their children would be taken away at the border. And the women were beside themselves. They were despondent. And I remember as I was speaking to them, they said, we have nowhere else to go. What else do we do? And it became clear to me that this was their only sense. They were willing to take that chance if it meant the safety for their kids.
Right.
I wished others could hear this. I wished others had witnessed this, had been privy to that conversation.
Okay, that's all really interesting. I do want to just clarify one thing. I think what you were saying a couple of minutes ago was that money is driving the policy to a certain extent.
Absolutely.
Private prison, you have these private companies that are running, not prisons as well, but specifically we're talking about immigration detention camps, are making major donations to politicians who therefore feel compelled to pass legislation that benefits their donors.
Including the bed quotas. You're absolutely right. In fact, I'll take it a step further since I did mention the Cuban experience. At one point with the wet foot, dry foot policies, there was the mandatory idea of Cubans being in immigration detention for 90 days. And they kept them right up until the 90 days, which became clear to me that this was a business. There was no reason. They knew they were going to be released. Why keep someone in prison for 90 days?
Right.
If you're not making money from it.
If you're not making money, yeah. So
and these are even so-called welcomed immigrants, right?
Right. So people who were going to be, there was no question, they were not going to be deported.
Exactly.
Yeah,
exactly.
And so they were simply held.
They didn't have to go to court. Yeah,
because there was a daily fee being paid to the private companies that were. Okay. Well, let's.
And it also comes out of our tax money, by the way. But out of our taxes. Yeah.
Right, of course. Let's turn, though, to mental health, which is your area of expertise and which is what I was in Miami to report on. Before going to Krome specifically, which prides itself publicly on what the great care it offers to detainees with mental health care issues, how serious is mental health as an issue for detainees? And I more specifically, I'm not asking you for a percentage, but my impression is that a fairly large number, or let's say a significant number of detainees have mental health issues, and not just Krome, but other facilities. And I was wondering your thoughts are on that.
Yes, absolutely. If they didn't have them already pre-existing or pre-morbidly, if you will, prior to the experience, they will have it upon entering. These systems are designed to break people's spirits. Make no mistake about it. They're not rehabilitated,
How is that? I mean, and what is it that, because Bud Conlon, the organization's,
the chair.
Organization's leaders said to me, more or less the same thing. If you don't go in with mental illness, you'll come out with mental illness. What is it about being detained in these facilities that drives people to a state of mental illness, even if they go in symptoms?
By design, a system that is trying to control others and manage large groups of people, and then add that into a prison, right? It watches your every move. You are dehumanized immediately. You're put in uniforms. The color designates who you are, how you're seen. You're ordered around. Everything is done by permission. Everything is, even going to the bathroom, there are no doors. There is no, you sleep in pods where you have tons of people in one space. Everything is determined by their schedule. Everything is controlled. Making phone calls, it's outrageously expensive how much the commissary charges. And again, the profits that they make from that on people who may have no money. So in order to contact an attorney, in order to reach out to family members, the isolation is just incredible. It's really a very, I've even observed people that started out being very, very stable, healthy individuals and watch them decompensate over time. It's a way of playing with someone's lives, with their will, with their hope, with their sense of hope. And it's really, this isn't who we should be as a country. It's easy to turn our backs and pretend, but is this who we want to be? If we're not so quick to dismiss it and stop to think about that and imagine that this could easily be any one of our family members or our ancestors, because we're all immigrants. What do we think of that?
Right.
Yeah.
And what about Krome in particular? Because this is a facility that publicly describes itself as offering incredibly compassionate care for detainees with mental illness. Yet my reporting, which was, I received a lot of help from your organization. I mean, I talked to people who are currently detained there and people who were previously detained there, and they do not describe such a glowing portrait that ICE and the Trump administration offer about Krome. What's your experience at Krome? I mean, there's a special unit that has approximately 30 beds for detainees with mental illness. What I observed was that there are a lot more detainees there with mental illness than the 30 held in that one unit, but that unit itself has problems, and that there's a whole host of problems at Krome, and that it is not offering model healthcare, mental health care treatment. Can you talk about some of the issues you've observed? Because you've been a visitor there. I mean, you're friends of mine.
Yeah.
Runs a visitation program, and you go in regularly and talk to people there. What's the sort of things you've seen? What are some of the problems?
It's really interesting. I guess everything's relative, right? So to boast that you have a wonderful mental health system is really when you compare it to places that have none. So anything, at that point, right? What's that expression? In the land of the blind, the one-eyed. But anyhow, so that said, yeah. So what I've observed, first of all, even the treatment center that they have, sadly, and I guess I don't want to necessarily give the name, but it really does not have the best reputation among those of us in private practice. So that is the
The
contract that
treatment
they
center
have.
or the hospital?
Yes. Well, the hospital has obviously, that facility, which is the one that provides their inpatient treatment. Now on site, which is obviously connected, but also it is their own division, right? Their own mental health wing. There are things that are rather dubious to me from when I visited. I know that some of the people who I'd speak to reported favorably about their experience with the psychologist in terms of feeling like she listened to them, but it periodically reminded them that she did work for Krome, which I guess ethically was probably the appropriate thing to do. It was her way of kind of sharing where her allegiance was, where her alliance was, and the limitations of her work, while still doing her best to maybe listen and be present for them or being empathic. But again, I wasn't, this is purely based on what people are saying, and I want to be fair. On the flip side, I remember on my first day of the tour, there was a guy, I wish I'd gotten his name at the time, but I remember him very clearly describing this protocol very proudly about how when someone is, when there is the threat of suicide, what we call suicide ideation. So if there's any belief that someone might be suicidal, they immediately grab them, strip them down, and put them in this padded room. And I remember as he said this, even though I understood the necessary precautions that we take, and obviously, as you know, we've heard a lot of cases of suicide in the news and the issues of different articles of clothing or bed sheets being able to be used, as ways of harming yourself. The way it was described could only be seen, honestly, as sadistic. It was something that was bone chilling to me. And I remember when I asked the person, and I said, and I kind of called him on that because it was really horrifying. This person, proudly boasted, well, these are the military practices. And, there was really no awareness of how much that could produce further decompensation. Recently, I followed up with someone who I'd visited, who I know had been in both this room as well as in isolation, in solitary. And I remember I asked them point blank, when they told me what they did to him and described what I was told. And then I said, how did that help? And he said, are you kidding me, doctor? That only made me feel worse. Imagine like having a bunch of people grab you and take your clothes off and doing these things to you. This really is not.
I'm sorry, but I mean,
sure.
when we spoke, when I was in Miami, you actually said that, this person you referred to at Krome, when he was describing this padded room where people who they believe may be suicidal are put, he said that this guy was a former military guy, and he said, this is where we strip them down, and this is where we strap them down, which does not like a terribly compassionate approach to someone. You also said that this person said it quite proudly and talked about, that's how I did it, or we did it in the military, and that's how we do it here. It just doesn't suggest a hugely compassionate approach.
I agree. Actually, you should know there. I was, upon speaking to someone whom it happened to more recently, he said that they're actually not strapped down, but they're given a vest, they are given a vest, a very heavy and non-bending so that they can't harm themselves with it. So it is a form of, but it's not quite the same as the idea of the old school straitjacket that they used to use, in other mental facilities.
Right.
So I just want to make sure to report accurately for you. But yes,
Okay.
Yeah.
Another thing I wanted to ask you about is because I also, and I note this in the New Republic story that just came out, that there were detainees who talked favorably about the psychologists they were seeing.
Yeah.
And I don't want to be unfair here, but I have to say that, I also heard that detainees are typically overly medicated. I talked to a guy who said in Rome, having never taken a sleeping pill or antidepressants and was immediately put on them. It seems like medication is used as a way of making the population more docile.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I may be being overly cynical here, and please correct me if you disagree, because you're a psychologist and I'm not. But
Hmm.
it's nice that they offer detainees a psychologist who the people I spoke to, spoke favorably of. But
Yeah.
giving people, like detaining people under miserable conditions, sometimes
Yeah. Yeah.
for the petty
Yeah.
of reasons, and then offering them a shoulder to cry on and calling that model healthcare treatment does not seem to me
Yeah.
to qualify as something that you want to be bragging about. I mean, it's better
I
that,
completely, yeah. I
yeah.
completely agree. I completely agree. Yeah, no. When you look at it systemically, I mean, people, if they try to take a micro approach, that you can say, well, yeah, the therapist seems to help them with mindfulness techniques. And yes, there's this medication management available. But again, very often, a lot of the class of drugs, what we call neuroleptic, are heavily sedating. And in fact, they are a form of controlling a group, right? A way of controlling and calming people down. And you see this in a lot of institutional arrangements. And it's been called out as being something that is not only not ethical, but really not. It's more beneficial for the people on duty, on staff, than for the patient themselves. It's
Right.
really for the benefit of those, to kind of keep people as docile as possible.
That's what I was told by detainees, and that
Yeah, yeah,
they said that
yeah,
they, for example, the guy I mentioned who said that he had never taken a sleeping pill or an antidepressant in his life and was suddenly being fed them,
yeah, yeah,
fed them because he was
yeah,
just like
yeah.
prescribed, and and it sounded like a form of control management, and
Of
that
course, of course.
and also there was one detainee I talked to who, and look, I'm not a psychologist and I can't claim that I, made the right reading, but this person was very charming and pleasant and motivated, and was, asked me for books, self-help books, because he was looking forward
Yeah,
to
yeah,
getting out. And, look,
yeah.
I'm not a psychologist, so maybe someone like you who regularly met with this guy would, I can't say that I can diagnose him. I can only say that he was the sort of guy who, I had that conversation with him on the outside. Had I
Hmm.
not known he was being treated for mental illness, I would never in a million years have thought that
Hmm.
he
Hmm.
was mentally ill. And I think that he's being treated with medications that he talked about that seem to be excessive. And also, from my observations, people who are depressed at Krome have, may not have been depressed. And look, again, we're
Yeah,
talking about
yeah,
a relatively
yeah.
small sample, but they may not have been depressed going in, but they suddenly, and I'm not going to say that everyone being held at Krome is a model person, I mean, but there were definitely people held at Krome that I talked to, or I know
Hmm.
your group
Hmm.
has talked to, who have been put there, because
Yeah,
they ran
yeah.
a stop sign, or they were
Uh-huh.
DUI. And I'm not going to say being, driving under the influence is a good thing, but
Yeah,
you
yeah,
suddenly find yourself for
yeah,
having committed an infraction that, if you're, if you
yeah,
have legal status,
yeah.
you may have to go to through an unpleasant process and go through the court system, but you don't end up locked up in a situation
Hmm.
that's bound to make anyone depressed. And
Hmm. Hmm. Hmm.
it seems to
Hmm.
me that Chrome creates depression,
Yes.
and it gets at, I guess, the issue you raised up top, which is, if you may go in healthy, mentally healthy, but anybody detained for a long period of time,
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
particularly people who are detained in pretty, I mean, the facility looks nice. I can't say that,
Hmm. Hmm.
it's not clean and sanitary, but the conditions that were described to me, you're held in pods with large numbers of people. As you said, there's no privacy. There are
Hmm.
definitely, issues with treatment by guards.
Hmm.
You
Hmm.
may, be held for a minor crime. There's no real limit on how long you can be held. There are technically some limits, but people have been held there for long, long periods of time. You don't know when you're going to get out. You're
Mm-hmm.
separated from your family. You may not be receiving family visits. This is because your family lives
Yeah.
away. I mean,
Yep.
it's a
Yep.
situation that any normal person would be depressed. I'm not saying that
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
everyone there who is diagnosed with depression is, was a perfectly, was mentally healthy going in, but I mean,
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
situation bound to
Yeah.
cause mental illness and depression and despair.
Yes. Yes. There's so many things. I'll go point by point, but centrally, Ken, you actually don't need my training to recognize if someone is high functioning or not. There are few exceptions of disorders, right, where people may have sort of identity splits or really
Right,
psychopathic tendencies. That is not what we're looking at here.
right.
So no one here, in the vast majority of cases, is going to deceive you in terms of signs of high or low functioning, right? So, for example, this person speaking to you, wanting books, talking to you about their plans. This is healthy behavior, especially under those circumstances. What you observed was correct. And what you're also noting, which I think is very powerful, is you're looking at a system that, by definition, the underlying, the strongest force, the thread is control.
Mm-hmm.
And when you do that, right, I mean, I don't want to bore you with all the developmental reasons why we resist that, but it's actually very healthy and appropriate to not want to be controlled, right? It's the reason why it's important for authority to be fair, do I mean to not be authoritarian and controlling, because this only creates more problems in the individual and in society at large. And now superimpose that on being put in these conditions in a situation where you're really kind of forgotten and thrown away,
Mm-hmm.
where under a law in which it seems there are far more discretionary practices by the judges than in any other law. Immigration law is really complex. So there's a lot more uncertainty, which only adds to the stress to the organism. And again, the potential to, fragment or decompensate, which is a way of saying break down psychologically.
Mm-hmm.
And then let's throw in another element, if you don't mind my mentioning, if you're familiar with the famous Stanford prison experiment.
Mm-hmm.
You're looking at conditions where, I believe that ultimately Dr. Zimbardo, who was actually the head of the psychology department at the time and later became the president of the American Psychological Association, at one point he noted that there were three types of prominent guards that emerged. You had and by the way, I've observed all three visiting over the years that I did. You had, what they call sort of the one that feels bad secretly and does certain things to try to does little extra things as a way to compensate maybe for their guilt. And
Mm-hmm.
it's very sad when you see that. You also have the tough but fair, someone who sort of doesn't really, respond with much empathy, but it doesn't really enjoy abusing. And then the third category is the one that really stands out, because I think these are people that are drawn to these jobs and they get paid well doing exactly what they love. And those are the sadistic guards.
Mm-hmm.
And I say this because if you look around, and I'm not trying to be unkind here, this really follows almost like a mathematical equation. It makes sense. It's a good fit to
Mm-hmm.
have someone like that in that job. They will probably be promoted often. More and more, they're whistleblowers, they're people who speak out. Thank God for them, because these are the ones that uncover these practices. But as you've noticed, even in the highest ranks, we hear people echo these sentiments and other people cheering as if this were some, it's a really interesting dynamic to observe. So when you see those guards that do derive pleasure out of having that control over another, and then you have an individual who is subject to that, or worse yet, an individual who is mentally ill, who, because of their diminishing ego or emotional resources, is more likely to act out in response. It is a vicious cycle where now they're going to be beaten down more in response psychologically.
Right.
And not to mention, I've certainly heard of physical abuses as well. And curiously, with the mentally ill, mostly. I don't doubt that the mentally ill probably makes people, it's more provocative to some people, but that's precisely the issue. You need people with training. This isn't a mental illness facility, So I'm talking now about people with history of mental illness. They are the minority, but they're there. And some of them are in long-term indefinite detention. And they're subject to all kinds of abuses.
Right. I
I
think.
hope I addressed every point, but there you go.
No, you did. You did.
Yeah.
And that's
Yeah.
really
Yeah.
helpful. And I mean, I want to just ask you one question to close, which is about the use of solitary. It's hard to know. I mean, in the story, I cite some data about Krome's use of solitary. There are facilities around the country that that have used solitary far more often, but they're much bigger facilities. So it's hard to know on like how to compare. But for example, Adelanto in California, which I think is the country's second largest detention camp, you have the use of solitary is or numerically, it's higher than at Krome. Krome has fewer detainees. And the data is also because there is no reliable data, because the data that I've been working with a group called the Project on Government Oversight and Reform, and they obtained data that showed the number of times people had been detained at Krome, but some of those people had been detained more than once. And so you don't know how many individuals were put into solitary, but we know, and you know, because you've talked to some people who were put into solitary, but there's no question, I mean, that the use of solitary, and there are cases we know of people who are mentally ill who were thrown into solitary, that being put into solitary is something that enhances or makes worse mental illness, because anyone, the healthiest person in the world, can be put into solitary and is not going to emerge in a healthy state. It's a debilitating experience, and I wanted to ask you about that issue, and also I wanted to ask you, I guess, again, because I'm not a psychologist, but it's just hard for me to see how solitary confinement is not going to make people who have mental illness worse off, and make people who, go in without problems emerge potentially with problems. I talked to, again, Bud Conlon, who said that conditions at Krome are so bad in general that detainees are constantly being disciplined and told what to do, and he said 25 to 35 times a day you're sort of said, okay, get up, get down, go to your meal, get out of the cafeteria, do this or do that. That is just scrutinized. But he said that it's a system that generates mental illness, and that he said, though, that the routine daily experience at Krome is so bad that some people he's talked to, some detainees, have said they try to get into solitary just to avoid the daily abuse, and he says to them, be careful, because you may get in, and if you're in for 4 days, maybe you'll be okay when you come out, but you go in for 4 days the first time and maybe 8 days the next and longer after that. He said, you're playing a very dangerous game, because put solitary for a long time, it's going to so
it is in fact considered a form of torture by many, precisely because that state, in fact, it's documented from Harry Harlow with the monkeys all the way up to in the Journal of American Psychiatry, and in probably more than one very respected established journals, that solitary does cause precisely psychological decompensation from depression, even within what we call the so-called, normal healthy organism, right? So from depression to into psychosis to a number of other problems, it is very severe. It is more severe than people recognize, and it's brutal.
Right. And just one last question. When I was talking to you in Miami, you said something that's really interesting. I mean, it's hard to get. I got into Krome as a community member, and effectively as a friend of detainees. And I went to talk to detainees not as a, didn't have the right to bring in pen and paper, but I was able to interview detainees as a community member. But no one, I mean, this was the first time that the journalist has gotten into Krome and was able to conduct independent interviews, because before the administration has allowed people in, but sort of stood over journalists' shoulders as they interviewed detainees. So I think I got a slightly different perspective. But of course, I didn't have free reign to wander around Krome. I got rough descriptions of what solitary is like, and people who are thrown into solitary, as I understand it, are kept there initially 23 hours a day, but then they reduced it after protest to 22 hours a day. But it's a pretty miserable existence. But you told me you'd spoken to detainees who were in solitary, and it's hard to get a reliable description because some of those people are mentally have mental issues, and it make it hard for them to describe the condition of their own confinement. So I wanted to ask you about, it sounds like you've heard conflicting descriptions of what it's like to be in solitary, because people who are put there sometimes do suffer from mental illness and have a hard time capturing where they were held and what the conditions were like.
Yeah. Sadly, it underlies the psychological disorganization produced by it, where the person doesn't really know. There's a feeling of derealization almost. There are a number of things related to that decompensation that it made it, it's sort of confirmed, and it was almost predictable, the responses to what exactly happens,
Right. Okay. Well, listen, I thank you very much for being on.
Thank you, Ken.
I look forward to staying in touch, and I'm going to be continuing to follow this issue. So I am sure I will be talking to you again down the road.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening, and be sure to tune in next week. This is the Washington Babylon podcast, hosted by Ken Silverstein and produced by Andrew Stewart.